Hello, I'm Bob Woodward, and I'm here today to talk to you about my opinion on Richard Nixon and how he dealt with the presidency. First of all, you might recognize my name from books such as All the President's Men and The Final Days. Back in the 70s, my partner Carl Bernstein and I were reporters at the Washington Post, and we basically helped to crack the Watergate scandal. Back then, when we were first investigating the burglary at the Democratic Party headquarters, we didn't know how big all of this would get. And it's one thing to think that a few dirty politicians are tampering with the votes, but then when it's your president, he's failed his country when he's tampering with everyone's votes. And the thing about Nixon is that he could do so much with the presidency. He could help so many people. He could change society. He could help us with our foreign and domestic policy, and that's the role of the president. But he fuels his administration with vengeance and hatred, and that's why it just doesn't work for him. He's not from the city and he's not from the upper class, and therefore lots of politicians ridiculed him for it, and they would call him a hillbilly and they would make jokes about him. But he hated these people so much that he let it take over his thoughts, and that was basically all he thought of. He was a very hateful, paranoid person. He wasn't very honest. He lied. The Watergate scandal. Yeah. So with devolution specifically, when you take federal money and power and you give it to the states, Nixon did a lot of this, but it seems sometimes like it's more for revenge on his mates from the upper class than actual love for states' rights. And his followers, they had lists of enemies, political enemies, and they would say that they would screw these people over using the presidency, and that's just not what the presidency is for. In my opinion, Richard Nixon blackened the name of the presidency, and he ruined it for years to come. He ruined it for Ford, and he ruined it for Carter. And he killed any trust that the American people could have in their government, and that really messed up America's psyche for the next few decades. And he failed the country. He failed the country that voted him into presidency the first time. And Richard Nixon was not the right man to be president, and that's my opinion.
President Nixon was by far one of the most interesting presidents I had to work with. If you haven't noticed already, I'm Henry Kissinger, and I was Nixon's chief advisor and Secretary of State. Honestly, I think that Nixon was a paranoid, racist guy. He would record everything, and by everything, I mean everything. He was an anti-Semitic, and never failed to display that in front of me. We shared a complex relationship. We agreed to disagree on so many matters. I was the one who kept him in check many times. His domestic policy wasn't the greatest, but he didn't focus on it enough. He dealt with stagflation well and also expanded the government, but that wasn't very conservative. He did do some good things, like the EPA and the affirmative action, but it simply wasn't enough. His racist views got in the way of creating real change and helping others. Nixon, although satisfactory at most in domestic policy, did quite some good things in regards to foreign policy. Of course, I was there to guide him along the way and make sure everything played smoothly. He actually wouldn't have won the 1972 election if I wasn't there advising him to prolong the Vietnam War until right before the election, making him the hero for bringing peace and putting an end to the war the nation had no hopes of winning. Nixon also handled China fairly well. Again, thanks to me. I was the only capable one to go to China and talk to Chow and Lai and improve our relations. As a result of this, Nixon was able to go to China and improve the country's ties, which led to better relations with the Soviet Union as well. And not to forget the Yom Kippur War. President Nixon just had his hands tied up in so many things that I was the one that had to deal with this big crisis while he was frantically trying to work out the Watergate scandal. According to me, he led to his own downfall. He just couldn't keep up with everything. I don't know what he would have done if I wasn't there at that time. He probably would have gotten impeached sooner. Overall, he wasn't the worst president we've had, but he did screw up pretty badly. He accomplished many great things, such as ending the war in Vietnam, publishing the Nixon Doctrine, accomplishing detente, and improving relations with our enemies. He was not the greatest at domestic policy. He was too involved in too many things. I never really liked Nixon, so to say, but I don't think he liked me either. Honestly, it's because he was jealous of me, being a Harvard graduate with a summa cum laude. But we worked together successfully. He was a smart guy, but he wasn't smart enough. His failures proves that perfectly.
Greetings, fellow Americans. I am historian Rick Perlstein, and I'm telling you, that's right, you, what I think of President Richard Nixon. Frankly speaking, I feel that President Richard Nixon was a bitter and resentful tryhard. He was constantly trying to gain favor with the elite, but he was rejected, and this man did not handle rejection very well. This rejection fueled his quest for revenge, and also made him the tricky and paranoid man he was. But he wasn't content with being the only hater of the elite, and so he had to go and dig up resentments out of the middle-class Americans. Before you know it, he has a huge crowd of supporters, many of whom were jealous and bitter of the rich just like he was. When he entered Whittier College, he was still pretty annoyed about the fact that he wasn't in Harvard. To add to his misery was the Franklin's Club, a group of the wealthy, privileged students, who in Richard Nixon's eyes were rich, popular snobs. And so he forms the Orthogonians Club, a club for the less privileged students like him, the ones who had to work hard, the ordinary kids. Nixon easily became king of the Orthogonians, and later on in his political career, he still had the support of these hard-working Americans, the ordinary workers, the white middle class. Nixon was tricky and manipulative. Watergate speaks for itself, but there are other issues as well. His Checkers speech is a prime example of how he managed to manipulate the American middle class into supporting him. Nixon announced to the public that he was just like the ordinary man. He drove an Oldsmobile. He couldn't afford to give his wife a fur coat, and he still had his mortgages to pay. As if this didn't convince the common public enough, Checkers the Cocker Spaniel won him many hearts regardless. But this was all an act, just an attempt to lure unsuspecting Americans into his trap by making them feel like they could relate to him. As a member of HUAC, Nixon's resentments heavily influenced him into accusing members of the elite as communist spies. For example, the Alger Hiss case speaks for itself. Alger Hiss was the guy Nixon wanted to be, the handsome, successful Harvard graduate. Nixon was almost envious of Alger Hiss, and so Nixon would not give up until the Alger Hiss case was heard. Nixon even went to great lengths to convince other committee members that the rich folk were full of communists. Talk about holding a grudge. I must admit that Nixon was a smart man, and many of his policies were worthy of praise. His environmental programs, affirmative action, and visits to China and Moscow were important decisions that he made and made America what it is today. But we can't ignore the fact that his legacy also includes the notion that there are two kinds of people in this world, the rich and the not-so-rich. Because of him, thousands of people came to be dissatisfied with the elite. He may have done some good things, but you can't ignore the fact that he was also a cheat. A tricky, sneaky, paranoid, manipulative cheat.
Hi, I'm Monica Crowley, Richard Nixon's foreign policy assistant and political confidant during the last few years of his life. I kept a daily diary of my experiences working with him and recorded our conversations verbatim. The Vietnam War defined his presidency, a generation, and our foreign policy for the 20th century. Nixon was caught in widening cultural, social, and political divisions regarding the war. Those who opposed action in Vietnam viewed Nixon as the enemy and encouraged instead free love, drugs, and anti-patriotism, etc. But the irony is that these such differences in values and ideas were exactly what Nixon disliked. He represented everything they were trying to overthrow, and yet he was their president. Even though Nixon remarked that he hated the Vietnam War because of its tremendous human, material, and moral costs, Nixon could never abandon those threatened by a communist regime. Perhaps Nixon's most significant foreign policy address was his silent majority speech, which rejected the Vietnam War as Nixon's war because of the anti-war sentiment, and instead labeled it as America's war. Nixon believed that in any conflict, the United States has to realistically evaluate our interests at stake. If the interests are vital but aren't minor, then we should rarely commit forces directly. But if our vital interests are in jeopardy, We should commit force directly and wholeheartedly. Admittedly, other ways of victory without force should be considered, but not without the assurance of committing our forces if necessary. Therefore, I believe his decision of Vietnamization or intensification of the war was because Nixon perceived the Vietnam War as a vital threat to the United States. Even with the Vietnam defeat, Nixon did preserve our freedom of our friends and allies in the region for over a decade. By holding off the North Vietnamese until the mid-1970s, Nixon allowed the region's developing countries to strengthen their own non-communist regimes. More importantly, the United States had to accept the victory of North Vietnam. However, that didn't mean Nixon was willing to accept the victory of countercultural values by the war opposers at home. A positive legacy of Vietnam was reversing that revolution of, as Nixon put it, hippie hoodlums. Nixon's history was neither a story of an epic hero or a shameful criminal. He was a complicated and controversial president, alternating between a brilliant mind and human flaw. He should be remembered as a man who negotiated peace between nations, but also as a man who ran, fell, picked himself back up, and ran again.
Greetings, fellow Americans. I am the historian Stephen Ambrose, and I'm addressing our nation on why I believe Richard Nixon deserves to be regarded as one of the nation's greatest leaders. When Nixon was vice president under President Eisenhower, he and his wife, Pat Nixon, embarked on the Journey of Goodwill tour of South America in April 1958. Although Nixon and his wife were spat on by anti-American demonstrators, and their limousine was attacked by a pipe-wielding mob in Caracas, Venezuela, his courageous conduct caused even some of his bitterest enemies to give him some grudging respect. During his first term as president in July 1971, President Nixon shocked the entire nation as he declared that he would visit China the following February. He became peacemaker when he met with the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, and the joint communique following this meeting recognized Taiwan as part of China and looked forward to a peaceful solution to the problem of reunification. Every U.S. president had ups and downs during their term in office, and I believe Nixon began losing his image in the eyes of the Americans with the publication of the Pentagon Papers, which were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg. The president was persuaded by the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, that the papers were more harmful than they appeared, and he tried to prevent the publication. However, the Supreme Court eventually ruled for the papers. President Nixon tarnished his image internationally with the Watergate scandal. The nation wondered whether if it would ever be able to trust his executive branch. Unable to bear the aftermath, Nixon worked diligently to rebuild his public image as an elderly statesman. Nixon portrayed himself as a senior statesman above the fray by supporting Ronald Reagan for president in 1980. Furthermore, Nixon wrote guest articles for many publications both during the campaign and after Reagan's victory. Nixon, both as a statesman and man, has been excessively maligned for his faults and inadequately recognized for his virtues. I myself have apparently started out not thinking very highly of Richard Nixon, but I do believe that Nixon wanted to be judged by what he accomplished. What he will be remembered for, however, is the nightmare he put the country through during his second term.